Former BC Premier slams politicians for abandoning Canadian values. Public speaks out. At a national conference on extremism and national security, a former British Columbia Premier delivered a sobering and emotional address that cut through decades of political silence. He spoke not just as a politician, but as a Canadian who had lived through the consequences of complacency. Recounting a personal journey that began with early warnings in the 1980s, he described how the threat of violent extremism was not just overlooked, but intentionally downplayed by the political elite. His message was urgent and unmistakable. Canada cannot afford to keep ignoring domestic extremist threats, especially those that risk turning multiculturalism into a cover for political cowardice. He began by referencing a time few Canadians remember vividly, the months before the 1985 Air India bombing. Then, he warned a government that the growing extremism in Canada, particularly among a fringe of radicalized Khalistani supporters, posed a grave danger. He even suffered a violent attack himself, hospitalized for his outspokenness, yet his appeals to the federal government went largely unanswered. He reached out to multiple attorneys general and the Prime Minister, sounding the alarm with as much clarity as possible. The silence he encountered, he said, was deafening and devastating. When the Air India bombing happened, killing 329 people, it was the deadliest terror attack in Canadian history. And still, the response from leadership was chillingly indifferent. He recalled, with sorrow and anger, how then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney sent condolences not to the Canadian families who had lost loved ones, but to Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. That act, according to him, epitomized the disconnect from Canadian responsibility and identity. It was as if the loss of 280 Canadian lives didn't matter because the victims were of South Asian origin. That indifference, he argued, revealed a deep and uncomfortable truth: systemic neglect rooted in racial and political bias. When the victims don't look like the majority, the grief is easier to ignore, he said, his voice steady but pained. As he addressed the room, his focus turned to the long arc of Canadian political inaction. For decades, he argued, successive governments have either ignored extremist groups operating within Canada or allowed them to function under the protection of free speech until their rhetoric turns to violence. He stated plainly that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms loses all moral force when it's used to shield those who preach hatred or support violence abroad. He emphasized that our core values, peace, tolerance, respect for democracy, are not gifts of the Charter but principles rooted in Canada's cultural DNA, forged through shared struggle and sacrifice. Without defending them actively, he warned, we risk watching them rot from within. The former premier was particularly critical of how political correctness has undermined national security. In his view, the modern political class has become too afraid to offend, too eager to placate, and too reluctant to name the threats that exist within our own borders. He lamented how fear of appearing intolerant has enabled actual intolerance to flourish, especially within small but dangerous circles that manipulate the language of identity and victimhood to mask a violent separatist agenda. He said that multiculturalism, while one of Canada's greatest strengths, must not become an excuse for silence in the face of extremism. When national unity is at stake, clarity must come before comfort. He singled out former Prime Minister Stephen Harper for praise, commending his recent remarks that any party seeking to govern Canada must categorically reject extremism, sectarianism, and separatism. It was, in the speaker's view, one of the few moments of political leadership on this issue that showed moral clarity. He called on current leaders, especially Prime Minister Mark Carney, to show the same courage. Carney, who recently led the Liberals to victory in the April 2025 snap election, has so far avoided direct public comment on Khalistani extremism. The speaker made it clear that diplomatic sensitivities with India should not stop Canadian authorities from taking firm, independent action against those plotting violence on Canadian soil. He argued that fighting extremism and maintaining diplomatic ties are not mutually exclusive. Canada can and must investigate and disrupt threats within its own borders without turning allies into enemies. A real leader can walk and chew gum at the same time, he said pointedly. The message was unmistakable. Ignoring a domestic threat to placate foreign relations is not diplomacy. It's denial. In fact, inaction could endanger both domestic safety and international credibility, especially when global partners see Canada as either unwilling or unable to confront the threats nurtured under its own protection. Turning to recent developments, he commended Canada's intelligence agency, CSIS, for finally releasing an unedited version of its 2024 report that acknowledged the presence and activities of Khalistani extremists in Canada. He alleged that under the Trudeau government, prior versions of this report had been censored or softened under political pressure, particularly from individuals with sympathies to the Khalistani movement. The unfiltered report, he argued, restores a level of transparency that is essential to national security and democratic accountability. Truth cannot be redacted, he stated firmly. If our institutions can't speak honestly, they cannot protect us. He also highlighted a worrying trend: growing efforts by extremists to provoke religious divisions within Canada, particularly between Hindu and Sikh communities. He cited multiple incidents involving harassment at Hindu temples, which he claimed were orchestrated to create an illusion of widespread conflict. These actions, he warned, are not grassroots movements, but part of a deliberate strategy to destabilize Canadian society and then export that chaos to India. He stressed that Hindu and Sikh Canadians have long shared peaceful, cooperative relations, and these provocations are meant to sabotage that harmony for political gain. The speaker pushed back strongly on the narrative that Sikhs in India are persecuted and therefore need a separate homeland. He cited recent surveys showing overwhelming Sikh patriotism and integration within Indian society. The radicals pushing for a Khalistani state, he said, are not representative of the broader Sikh population, either in Canada or India. To them, he issued a biting challenge. If you truly seek a separate homeland, why not carve it out of Canadian land? Why hijack another sovereign nation for your fantasy? It was a provocative question, but one that echoed through the room with uncomfortable honesty. He closed his speech by reaffirming his commitment to confronting extremism and defending Canada's foundational values. He said this struggle would be neither easy nor short-lived, but it was necessary. He urged fellow Canadians to stay vigilant, to stand up for democratic institutions like CSIS, and to speak out when others won't. Silence, he reminded the audience, is not neutral, it is complicity. And the stakes are too high for complicity to continue unchecked. As he finished, he thanked the organizers and attendees for showing the kind of courage that's lacking in far too many official circles. In a quiet moment that followed, the host of the event noted that no major Canadian media outlet had covered the conference. Despite its national relevance and high-profile speakers, the issue had been ignored. The public was asked to support independent journalism and share the message. The fight against extremism is not just about politics, it's about the future of Canada. The former Premier's voice might not echo through Parliament or headline the evening news, but to those listening, it carried more weight than any political soundbite. It was the sound of conscience.